From the cloud in Copenhagen, welcome to the webinar Overcoming Regulatory and Policy Barriers to Catalyzing ESCO Development Globally, hosted by the Copenhagen Center on Energy Efficiency. My name is Aris. I'm working as a program officer at the Copenhagen Center, and I will be the moderator for today's webinar. A couple of things before we move to the main content of our webinar. This webinar is going to be about 60 to 70 minutes long, including time for Q&A at the end. In case you cannot stay until the end or want to get back to our presentations, all the materials and the recording of the whole webinar will be available online in a few days. Now, before we start discussing about today's topic, I would like to inform our attendees that we comply with the General Data Protection Act, also known as GDPR. This means that your personal data, such as name, email, workplace, etc., is safely processed and stored, and all of your rights pursuant to the GDPR are respected. You have full access to the data being processed about you, and at any time you can request that inaccurate data be deleted or rectified. For access or further information, please contact with the people that are presented here. Now, a few things about the Copenhagen Center. The center conducts research and advisory activities in the field of energy efficiency and serves as energy efficiency hub for the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. The center has an established network of global, regional, and national partners with a broad range of stakeholders to help accelerate the implementation of energy efficiency activities. On a regular basis, the global ESCO network will be conducting webinars. All materials, including recordings and the presentations from previous webinar and future ones, can be found on Global's ESCO network library under the webinar section. The material of today's webinar will be uploaded shortly, but until then, you can check the previous one. I would like to briefly introduce the speakers of today's webinar. Mr. Limaye is President and CEO of SRC Global Incorporation and is internationally recognized as a pioneer and entrepreneur with over 45 years of experience in energy efficiency and energy services. And Søren is working as a senior economist at UNEP DTU Partnership. He has a PhD in climate policy with experience from 10 years of service in the Danish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Finally, I would like to inform you that you can send us your question during the presentations using the dedicated icon, and we will do our best to answer as many as we can at the end. Please do not forget to mention the name of the panelist that the question is for. And now, I would like to give the floor to Søren.
Thank you very much, Aris, and welcome everybody to our first in a series of 10 webinars this year in 2021 from the Global ESCO Network. The Global ESCO Network is a new organization. We were established about a year ago, and in fact, Dilip is part of what we call the founding fathers of the organization, which is now up and running since the end of last year. This first webinar here is the beginning of the activities of the network for 2021. The network was established with a vision to be a global driver and inspire government action for scaling up the ESCO's contribution to the global response for mitigating the threat of climate change, simply because we saw that ESCOs were not, at least in our view, sufficiently represented in countries' nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement. We think that energy efficiency, and particularly ESCOs, have a much greater role to play, and that's the basic reason and the motivation for us establishing the Global ESCO Network. It is a network of networks. It's not organizing ESCO companies, it's organizing ESCO associations around the world, of which there is about 40, and we have organized so far about 2/3 of the organizations. Of course, we welcome new organizations, the remaining ESCO associations, to join the network. On that basis, we hope to be fulfilling our missions, and we have a long list of missions. In fact, we have 8 missions defined, and you will be able to find those on our website. The webinar today is in support of issue number 4 here, which is to document the benefits of applying ESCO principles in business and policy development through international mapping and benchmarking of framework conditions for the operation of ESCOs and their achievement of material energy savings. We consider the regulatory environments for ESCOs a main obstacle, and that is also why Dilip is speaking on that subject today. We intend over this year to be mapping those regulatory barriers in a number of countries. First and foremost, in the countries where ESCO associations exist, because we cannot do this without the collaboration of ESCO associations to help us map and publish also the barriers, the regulatory hindrances that ESCOs are experiencing in their daily work. We need to bring that to the attendance of policymakers, and we intend to do that on the basis of a thorough mapping of those conditions in a number of countries. We did a very brief analysis just before Christmas among a number of our associations, just to identify or have an opinion about the importance of different elements of regulatory barriers, and this is the outcome of that. We will be publishing more on these barriers shortly on our website also. But what we can see here is the three main regulatory barriers as identified by many ESCO associations in our analysis just before Christmas is there's simply a shortage of specific savings target for public and private buildings. There's also specific legislation lacking for public procurement and tendering, and the creation of specific legislation for the operation of ESCOs is also lacking, including model contracts for energy performance contracting. We will come back to more of this, and I'm sure that Dilip will also be presenting elements of this in his presentation in 10 seconds. Just a final word from here. I mentioned this is the first in a series of webinars. We are having 10 webinars upcoming for this year. This is the overview of the next, of the first 5, of which Dilip's presentation here today is the first. We hope to see as many of you as possible for our future events as well. Visit us on globalesconetwork.org, and with this, I hand over the microphone to Dilip. Thank you.
Thank you, Søren, and welcome everyone to the seminar on, or webinar on, regulatory and policy barriers to ESCOs and how they may be addressed. As Søren has pointed out, energy efficiency has been recognized as the first fuel, as the most cost-effective way of meeting our climate challenges, and the international organizations have established some very important and aggressive targets for energy efficiency implementation. It has also been recognized worldwide that the implementation of energy efficiency projects can be substantially helped by energy service companies who have already shown the success in many countries. However, we also recognized that development and promotion of ESCOs in a country is limited by a large number of regulatory and policy barriers. And these have been challenges that the ESCO industry has faced in many countries. So my discussion today is highlighting the issues related to ESCO development, the policy and regulatory barriers, and how those barriers can be addressed in the future by countries. Let me start off by talking about the potential role of the government versus the market in promoting energy efficiency. Obviously, we all want the markets to function. We all want the ESCO markets to develop and those ESCO markets to be actively involved in implementing energy efficiency projects. The government's role in doing this can be a number of different things. For example, the governments can develop the appropriate policies and programs to help implementation of energy efficiency. They can also provide incentives to make energy efficiency attractive, and they also need to stimulate the market development, particularly the development of the ESCO market and the supporting financial infrastructure. So sustainable development of energy efficiency projects and financing these projects requires first that banks and financial institutions, the private financing market, needs to participate, because in the long term, governments cannot finance everything. They can stimulate, they can provide incentives, but the private sector commercial market has to participate. And this in turn can both require and help the growth and development of the energy services markets in which ESCOs can thrive and perform their functions. Another important thing here is the governments need to provide examples by implementing energy efficiency in their own buildings and facilities. We have noticed in many cases that government facilities, particularly publicly owned facilities, are notoriously inefficient due to a number of reasons. And improving the efficiency of those facilities and using ESCOs to do that can be a major help to the development of ESCOs. Let me start off by defining the whole idea of energy services and energy service companies. And I start off by talking about what I refer to as the energy services value chain. This includes a large number of different functions that are involved in implementing energy efficiency projects. And they include energy auditing, design and engineering of efficiency projects, procurement of equipment, installation and commissioning of the equipment, financing, operation and maintenance, facility management, and sale of energy services or the sale of energy. ESCOs can provide some or all of these services, and the name ESCO has been defined to include many different types of organizations. But in general, the major characteristics of ESCOs are that they can integrate all of these different functions to provide a full service to their customers in implementing energy efficiency projects. As I mentioned, there are many different types of business models in the energy services field, and many of them are referred to as energy service providers or energy service companies. For example, in looking at the different ways that energy service providers operate, you can look at an engineering services business model where services are provided for engineering and design, but are performance-based with payments tied to performance. Financial services such as supplier credits or equipment leasing. Performance contracting, which is the most common way that ESCOs operate, and they include the so-called guaranteed savings programs, shared savings programs, as well as outsourced energy management, which is the top part, where the ESCO actually takes over the energy using equipment and sells the energy output. And this is called chauffage or outsourced energy management. The characteristics are that these models are that as we go up the list here, the ESCOs are assuming more and more of the risk, but providing more and more benefits to the customer or the host facility. But in general, all of these models are compatible with the concept of ESCOs and can be considered as part of the development of the ESCO market. Now, I've been working in the ESCO field for more than 20 years, maybe even more than that, because back in the 80s, we started doing ESCOs in the US. And over the years, I have kind of developed a major characteristic of ESCOs. What are the key parameters or key functions that an ESCO provides? So energy service companies first provide or arrange a complete package of services. And I mentioned some of these earlier in that energy services value chain. Generally, they provide the complete package. They offer a range of business models, most of which are characterized by the fact that customers will pay for the energy services from the cost savings achieved from those services. So the ESCO performs a function, creates an opportunity to save energy and energy costs, and the customers pay from those savings. ESCOs also accept payments contingent upon achieving guaranteed performance. This is a very important characteristic. These are performance-based contracts, performance-based functioning, and payments are only made when that performance target or performance guarantee is accomplished. And finally, ESCOs assume most or sometimes all of the technical, financial, and performance risks. And all these different ESCO business models we talked about generally have all of these characteristics. Now, one of the key issues is doing energy efficiency projects in the public sector. I mentioned earlier that governments need to provide the opportunities and to ESCOs to work in the public sector because it is generally inefficient and has large opportunities for improving energy efficiency. Public sector managers generally do not have the capacity to implement projects themselves or even to identify the options themselves, and they need help in identifying, designing, and implementing assistance. And ESCOs are a great organization, or a great type of organization that can provide such services. And this has been pointed out in many, many countries that I have worked in. But as we know, working in the public sector creates or presents many barriers to ESCO. So the road to ESCO success is not simple. It faces many barriers. I'll list just some of them. Public procurement regulations sometimes make it very difficult for ESCOs to function because quite often they require the selection of the least cost provider, not necessarily the best value provider. Public agencies, if they save energy, if ESCO comes in and installs equipment to save energy, their budgets next year are reduced because their budgets are now geared toward the energy payment. So they are not allowed quite often to retain the energy savings from which they can pay for the ESCO services. In many countries, public agencies are even limited from signing multiple year contracts because budgets are done every year and they are renewed year by year. And it is sometimes very difficult for them to sign a contract in which they can pay for the ESCO services over multiple years. They have limited internal capacity to implement or manage the energy efficiency projects and the ESCO contracts. There are also limits to borrowing. So public agencies generally cannot borrow from commercial banks or commercial financial institutions. This happens for a number of reasons. For example, in some cases, they are not allowed to incur debt or loans. In some cases, even if they are allowed to incur debt, they're already borrowed up to the limits of their financing. That generally limits on how much they can borrow. And therefore, the ability to borrow funds to pay for projects is very limited. And finally, we have this issue where in public agencies, there's one person responsible for the capital budget and another person responsible for operating budgets. And the use of capital budgets to save money in the operating budgets becomes somewhat difficult. So there are a number of other challenges. I've kind of summarized some of them here, but these barriers make it very difficult for ESCOs to sign performance-based contracts with government agencies. So what can governments do to help the ESCO industry? I'm going to spend a little bit of time and discussing some of the things that we have experienced in working in a number of countries, developing countries in Eastern Europe, in Asia, South and East Asia, in parts of Africa, and a little bit in Latin America. Government can take a series of actions, and I have divided these into three types of actions. The first one is that you need to create a large and stable demand for ESCO projects in the public sector. When we were trying to do this in a couple of countries, India being one, and some of the Southeastern European countries being others, we talked to a number of international ESCOs and we said, what would it take for you to enter a new country and provide ESCO services, either by yourself or in partnership with local companies who are interested in becoming ESCOs, because there aren't any right now. And the response generally was, well, we need to know that there's a sufficient market for our services. We're not going to invest money in entering a market when we don't know that there is a big demand for these kinds of projects. So the governments need to do that. Secondly, they need to remove some of the barriers to the public procurement of ESCOs. And I mentioned some of these barriers earlier, and I will talk about how some of these things can be done. Thirdly, one of the biggest challenges to ESCOs is the ability to get sufficient and affordable financing. ESCOs generally invest a certain amount of money. The amount of money they invest is limited by their own resources. And if they want to scale up and provide large-scale implementation of projects, they need to have sufficient access to capital. So what can governments do to help that happen? Let's look at some of these. So first is creating a large and stable demand for ESCO services. What can be done here is first, you need to make the public agency managers, particularly the facility managers and engineers, as well as their top management, aware of energy efficiency benefits and aware of the fact that there are organizations called ESCOs that can help them in implementing these. So we need to train, educate, communicate with these public agency managers. Secondly, increase their capacity to identify opportunities for energy efficiency and opportunities for ESCO services that can implement energy efficiency. Thirdly, the governments need to establish targets. This has been a very important part of the development of the whole ESCO industry in the United States, where the government, over a number of years, the federal government established significant targets for energy efficiency and cost reduction in public buildings and facilities. And then many of the state governments followed. This needs to be done to incentivize, to motivate public agency managers to undertake energy efficiency programs. Also, we need to have standardized templates for contracts, benchmarks for energy efficiency technologies, and appropriate measurement and verification protocols that can help the public agencies recognize that savings are being achieved, that performance guarantees are being satisfied, and contractual arrangements are simplified. This has been done in many countries where there are standard contracts that have been developed to help the ESCOs deal with public agencies. Organize workshops in which public agencies and ESCOs actually get together and talk to each other. We've had one situation when I was in the early days when I was trying to develop the ESCO industry in India. We actually managed to get under government sponsorship a few ESCOs and a few public agencies together. And it was clear that they were not understanding or talking to each other very well. The ESCOs didn't understand the problems faced by the public agencies. The public agencies didn't understand how the ESCOs operated and how their operations could be helpful to them. So organizing these kinds of workshops to exchange knowledge becomes quite important. Project aggregation, trying to aggregate public agencies into bundles of projects that will make the ESCOs develop larger projects. For example, instead of doing one school at a time, you can aggregate 15 or 20 schools which have the same kinds of requirements, lighting efficiency, cooling efficiency, so on. If you aggregate them, it becomes a more manageable and more financeable project and reduces the transaction costs of achieving that project. And finally, one of the issues is the credibility of ESCOs. So the governments can establish ESCO accreditation or certification schemes. This has also been done in many countries, and I'll give some examples later. So this helps create a credible ESCO industry and allows the potential customers to deal with them knowing that they have been recognized or accredited by the government. The second area is removing the barriers to procurement of ESCO services. Here we have the need for an ability to sign multiple year contracts, because the whole concept of the ESCO industry is that ESCOs make the investment, they're paid from the savings, and generally they're paid over a number of years because the savings can accrue for as many as 10, 15 years since the equipment that is installed to achieve the energy efficiency can last that long. But unless there's some assurance that they're going to get paid over a number of years, they cannot function. Very important, allow the retention of energy cost savings. As I mentioned earlier, in many countries, budgeting is done annually, and the budget for this year's energy cost is based on last year's energy cost. So if you spend money, or if the ESCO spends money and saves energy, the energy costs go down, and in the next year's budget, the government says, okay, you spent X dollars last year, we're going to give you X dollars this year, plus maybe a couple of percent more. That does not allow the public agency to pay for the ESCO services. So therefore, a mechanism has to be found to retain the energy cost savings. Change the procurement rules. When you're doing a competitive bidding process for efficient equipment or efficient services, you cannot simply base it on the lowest cost. In fact, the lowest cost equipment might in the long term have much higher life cycle costs. This is particularly true of motors, pumps, and lighting, efficient lighting technologies. So we need to have the procurement procedures changed to select the contractor that provides the most value, not the least cost. Exclude ESCO payments from public agency debt. If payments to ESCOs, if you achieve the top three things, and okay, you can sign multiple contracts and you can retain energy savings, but if an ESCO contract is considered as debt, then that creates an issue for agencies that have debt limits or cannot incur debt. This is the consumption-based billing is an important item in countries that have district heating systems. And this is particularly true in Eastern and Central Europe, where district heating billing is done not in terms of how much energy is consumed, but in terms of how many square meters of space is used by the building. And if that is the case, there is no incentive to save energy because your billing remains the same because it's based on the area. So consumption-based billing becomes very important. And public sector has a potential role to play here if the markets can be created. So facilitating public-private partnerships and energy efficient equipment leasing can also go a long way towards helping the ESCOs provide services. And finally, some of the ESCO models that have been used in developed countries are quite complex, and public agencies in developing countries quite often have difficulties understanding them. So create simpler models to start with, define the simple performance-based criteria, and then as the markets mature, go to the more complex models. The third area is financing. And as I mentioned earlier, financing is a critical challenge for ESCOs. So facilitating financing, establish energy efficiency revolving funds. In some countries in Eastern Europe, these have been developed. Bulgaria, Romania, Armenia are good examples. Also, these funds can provide loans to agencies that can undertake loans. But also another very interesting concept that has been successfully implemented in some countries is the idea of energy service agreements. So for schools and kindergartens, and in some cases healthcare facilities, who cannot take on loans, the fund or the government agency can actually take on an energy service agreement in which they provide services to the agency and recover their money from the energy budgets. They would then engage the ESCOs to actually perform the energy efficiency services projects. So creating a fund of this kind can be very helpful. In some cases, you need to provide grants. I know grants are not a sustainable mechanism, but in many countries, what we have found is that public facilities are not providing the required comfort levels. They are either underheated so that the the heating requirements are not sufficiently met. This requires infrastructure improvements, improving the building structure. ESCOs cannot take on that responsibility of improving comfort level. So the government has to work with ESCOs for the ESCOs to essentially provide the services to install efficient equipment, but where there's comfort level improvement required, the ESCO needs to be subsidized by the government through grants or other mechanisms so that they do not have to take the responsibility of providing the comfort levels that are currently not existing. Risk sharing is very important, and providing a risk sharing facility such as credit guarantees or risk guarantees, and this has also been done in many countries, can help ESCOs reduce their risk and undertake projects. Facilitate forfeiting of ESCO contracts. What this means is that once the ESCO gets a contract, it signs a long-term contract to get payments from the customer. The ESCO has already committed its investment, and the amount of investment it can commit is dependent on their ability to raise the capital. The forfeiting option involves an agency or a fund to buy out the future cash flows of the ESCO from the contract. So they essentially will buy out the future cash flows and therefore allow the ESCO to have more capital to undertake more projects. This has been successfully done in a case with EBRD financing in Bulgaria. Finally, the governments can establish a public ESCO or a super ESCO. Now, this is essentially a government agency that takes on the responsibility of dealing with other government agencies, such as the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Health, Ministry of Public Administration, and signs agreements with them to implement projects. It is easier for one government agency to sign a contract or an agreement with another government agency, much easier than an ESCO doing that. So this creates what is called a public ESCO or a national super ESCO. But the idea here is that this public ESCO then essentially uses the private sector ESCOs to do a number of the functions in the energy services value chain. The public ESCO takes on the responsibility of the contractual and financial aspects, but essentially delegates the technical aspects, the design, engineering, construction, implementation, M&V, and so on, thereby allowing the ESCOs to develop their capacity and to engage in more and more of these projects in the future. Financing, as I mentioned, is a very important idea and a very important item of ESCO development. And we have worked, particularly at the World Bank, with looking at the different ways of financing energy efficiency projects. What I've shown here is something we refer to as a financing ladder, at the bottom of which is grants. And for many years, the international financial institutions provided grants to governments to implement projects. These were basically 100% subsidized by the international agencies. And that worked in the sense that you demonstrated projects, you could show that energy could be saved, but it is not sustainable. You cannot providing grants for hundreds of projects or thousands of projects. So you need to move on to other financing mechanisms. And we've looked at direct lending by the financial institutions to municipal utilities, on-bill financing through electric or gas utilities, energy savings capture model in which you actually allow the agency to set aside in the budgeting process, set aside the energy savings from 1 year into a special account. Essentially, you capture the energy savings into a special account and use that account in the future to implement additional projects and to pay off the ESCOs or others who have made the investment. Energy efficiency revolving funds, I mentioned that earlier. These have been done in a number of countries. Public or super ESCOs, credit lines with development banks or commercial banks, risk guarantees and bonds, supplier credits, and finally, advanced commercial financing. The idea here is that at the bottom of the ladder is primarily public financing. At the top of the ladder is commercial financing. We want to get to the top of the ladder. We want to get to the place where commercial banks or financial institutions can finance ESCOs on a project financing basis. but you can't get there in one step. So quite often you have to start somewhere towards the bottom end of the ladder and gradually move up as the market matures, move from public financing to commercial financing. I've talked a lot about what can be done. Let me give you some examples of actions that have been taken by some governments. In Germany, there is a model called the procurement agent model. This is not quite a public ESCO, but there's an organization called the Berlin Energy Agency, which actually provides guidance, a government agency that provides guidance to public agencies for procuring ESCO services. So they take on the responsibility of defining the project requirements, developing the contractual documents, working with one or more ESCOs, creating a competitive process to select the ESCOs, and then monitor the performance of the ESCO and do the M&V. Facilitating public procurement. The Czech Republic reformed their public procurement laws and procedures to allow specifically for ESCO contracts with public agencies. I mentioned project bundling. In Hungary, there was a single procurement of ESCO services for all energy services to public schools in Hungary. This was like a $250 million contract won by a competitively bid ESCO consortium, under which they could provide lighting and other services to all public schools. I mentioned forfeiting earlier in Bulgaria. This was a special fund to purchase the ESCO cash flow in the future and thereby provide ESCO capital to undertake additional projects. There have been many examples of revolving funds with loan facilities in the UK, for example, but also Bulgaria and Romania. And revolving fund with energy service agreements. The most successful one of these is in Armenia, where the Armenia R2E2 fund, which stands for Renewable Resources and Energy Efficiency Fund, signs energy service agreements with public agencies. They've done hundreds of projects. I mentioned public and super ESCOs. A public ESCO was established in Croatia. It was established under an electric utility to provide energy efficiency services throughout the country. And in India, the national government has established EESL, Energy Efficiency Services Limited, to develop, finance, and implement all public sector projects throughout the country. So some of these things have been done and have proved successful. So how do we move forward in a country that needs to develop the ESCO market to contribute towards their NDC contributions and meeting the Paris Agreement goals? Here's what I call is a roadmap for doing this. The first step is that you need to identify the current market situation. Are there existing ESCOs? What are their capacities, strengths, and limitations? What are the financing issues? What are the financial markets like in the country? What are the budgeting and procurement rules and regulations that create barriers? What are the borrowing capacities and limits for public agencies? Basically, it's a situation analysis to figure out what the current market is. Consult with the second step, consult with the stakeholders. Stakeholders include public officials involved in budgeting, procurement, technical assessments, legal, and so on. Discuss with existing and potential ESCOs, the wannabe ESCOs, financial markets, to identify the needs and challenges and identify the barriers. Then do the 3 steps I talked about. Create the demand for energy services, energy efficiency services, ESCO services. That is, increase the knowledge, awareness, and capacity of public agencies, establish the goals and action plans, create targets, provide recognition and awards to people that do successfully implement ESCO projects, standardize the documents, bundle the procurements, and so on. Remove the barriers to public procurement, allow multiple year contracts, allow agents to retain cost savings, use most value instead of least cost in public procurement, facilitate private sector participation through PPPs, allow leasing, and exclude ESCO payments from public debt. Facilitate financing. This requires options such as energy efficiency revolving funds, perhaps credit lines if the banks are willing to accept those and work with ESCOs, energy service agreements, funding energy audits of public agencies, providing grants and guarantees as appropriate, and creating potentially a public or a super ESCO. And then develop and test simple procurement models. A simple procurement system with well-defined rules, regulations, and procedures, and appropriate supporting documents that will facilitate public agencies to deal with ESCOs. And as that is done, and as experience is gained, learn from the results of the simple models to develop the scaling up strategies, to provide results of the demonstrations and so on, and introduce more complex models involving greater involvements of ESCOs and financial institutions, and further development of the standardized contract documents and measurement and verification protocols. So here's a roadmap, and obviously countries can adapt this roadmap to their specific situation. I'm going to stop here, taken enough time. I would welcome any questions, comments, etc. Thank you.
So, thank you very much, Dilip, for your very thorough presentation. Now it's time for the Q&A session. So I would like from our speakers to activate the web cameras. And also unmute themselves. Excellent. Now that I have both of you here, I'll start the first question with you, Dilip. And the question is, should measurement, verification, and reporting be included in the value chain for energy services?
Yes, the answer is definitely yes, because one of the key characteristics of ESCO contracts is some level of performance guarantee, whether it's a guarantee of energy efficiency improvement, whether it's a guarantee of energy savings, cost savings, or some other parameter. And the key characteristics is that they have to meet that guarantee in order to be paid. So it is important to have a way to measure and demonstrate these guarantees have been met. And measurement and verification, therefore, becomes an important item of the ESCO contracts. And of course, there is, as people well know, there is a International Performance Measurement and Verification Protocol, IPMVP, which has now been adapted in more than 30 countries, that provides kind of the methodology and the approach for doing the MNV. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dilip. The next question is also for you. And the question is, what is the difference between the government role to develop the ESCO market through the mentioned activities and creating a super ESCO company?
Creating a super ESCO company is one element of government action. It may or may not be the best action, but clearly in some countries, a super ESCO has been very successful. Examples include Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia, India, and a province in China. The idea of a super ESCO and the proper function of a super ESCO is to quickly scale up the ability to sign up multiple agency contracts. And the idea of the super ESCO, at least the way I would define it, is that the super ESCO essentially engages in what I call framework agreements with agencies. So the super ESCO is created as a separate entity. It has a separate board of directors owned by the government. The government appoints the board. It is still a government agency, so it can sign contracts with, say, the Ministry of Education or Ministry of Health to take on the responsibility of doing energy efficiency in all of the schools or all of the hospitals, all of the clinics. But it does not do all the work by itself. It essentially acts as the reason it's called a super ESCO is act as an ESCO of ESCOs, that it basically takes on the financing and contractual responsibilities, but delegates or subcontracts the functioning of the actual engineering design and installation type of things to the private ESCOs. This has been very successfully done in some countries like Dubai, Saudi Arabia. Not so much in India, where the ESL has actually established its own staff to do the energy efficiency projects. But in the proper super ESCO environment, the government creates the super ESCO and helps it by creating some of these other mechanisms to allow it to work with public agencies, and yet allow or require that super ESCO to engage private sector ESCOs to do the actual implementation work, thereby building the capacity of the private ESCOs and allowing them to participate eventually even in the private sector market.
Thank you very much, Dilip. The next question is for you, Søren, and the question is, how can I support your research on regulatory barriers for ESCOs?
Yeah, thank you, Aris. As I mentioned in the beginning, we are starting up the analysis work this year on the regulatory environments for ESCOs in select countries. We haven't selected the countries yet, so right now we are actually open to input from all kinds of sources. We would like anybody out there who are interested in helping us identifying those barriers, simply to come forward and drop us an email and let us know if you would like to assist us in identifying those pieces of legislation. And maybe I should give an example of what it is we're looking for, because there are already maps of energy efficiency promotion programs out there. The governments are having programs, temporary programs, where they're supporting the phase out of inefficient ACs or other appliances. Those are, well, nice to have. They're good programs. They're normally temporary. That is not what we're looking for. We're looking for those that are more permanent barriers, as also Dilip has mentioned. In some countries, it's difficult to figure out how to deal with ESCO contracts tax-wise. Does the tax bill or the tax regulation in a given country form a specific barrier to ESCO operation? Those are the kinds of barriers that we're looking for. So anyone who can help us give us sort of identifying those pieces of legislation in countries, we would be most thankful for your help in bringing our attention to whichever area it is. It doesn't have to be tax only. It could also be for procurement rules, or basically all the regulations that Dilip has been talking about. So please come forward.
Thank you very much, Søren. The next question is for you, Dilip. And the question is, how do super public ESCOs back off the risk to the technical ESCO subcontractors? Do they arrange guarantees for the services the technical ESCO provides?
The super ESCO will have to work with the subcontractors. The subcontractor ESCOs will still have to provide the performance guarantees to the super ESCO. The super ESCO then in turn guarantees to the agency the performance and helps manage that entire process. So the ESCOs are still responsible for the performance guarantees, but are not responsible for financing, because the super ESCO provides the financing and the contractual arrangements. This has been worked very successfully in some of the ESCOs in the Middle East, particularly Dubai and the Saudi Arabian one.
The next question is, with an electricity market model based on single buyer, can we foresee the development of ESCOs, public or private?
Well, in many countries, there are already the single buyer markets. And I don't see why that could preclude the development of performance-based contracts for implementing energy efficiency. The only question with these single buyer models is the question of, who defines what the savings are. And if there's a central electricity buyer, the prices or the benefits of the savings are determined by that market. But ESCOs can still function within that parameter. That is, the savings are still valued on the basis of the total savings, the electricity cost savings achieved.
Thank you very much. The next question is, how do you secure payments from municipalities with poor credit standing?
There is a big challenge with municipalities, agents, not just municipalities, other public agencies that do not have the proper credit, they do not have the collateral to do the financing, and that creates a challenge. And I think the model that I mentioned earlier, the idea of energy service agreements, is one that has worked pretty well in Armenia and one or two other countries. And the energy savings capture model is another one. So let's talk about both of those. In the energy service agreement model, the World Bank created a fund, the R2E2 fund. The fund essentially worked with municipalities and said, let's say you're paying 100,000 euros for your energy bill annually, and you're getting that budget from your ministry or whoever funds you, maybe from the municipality's own funds or some ministry of the central government. What we would like you to do is to put that budget, 100,000 euros, into an escrow account each year for the next 5 or 7 years. We will invest our money in improving your energy efficiency. We will pay the energy bills, the reduced energy bills from that fund, and we will recover our investment from the remaining benefits. So in other words, if your bill was 100,000 and I reduce it as the fund, I reduce it to 70,000, there's 30,000 there that is still in that escrow account that I will use to pay for my services and return on my investment. Once I have recovered my investment over the period of time, whether it's 5 years or 7 years, then I go away and you retain all the savings for yourself. This has worked pretty well for those agencies that cannot borrow money, that do not have the credit, but they are backed up obviously by the fact that budgets are being provided to them by the central government or some minister. The second potential mechanism is the idea of this energy savings capture. We have worked in one country in Central Asia right now where we have created this mechanism under which the ministry, this is for water utilities in this country, the ministry provides the budgets to the water utilities. What we have said is that if a fund is created that invests in improving the energy efficiency of the water utility, we measure the savings, and the ministry then puts the savings for a period of X years, generally 5 years or some period, into a special budgetary account. The ministry then accumulates that account, and that account is used to pay back the investment made by the fund and possibly to make new investments. So this creates a sustainable mechanism in which energy savings are captured and utilized for future projects. This has been done in Montenegro and is being proposed to be done in Uzbekistan. Thank you.
Thank you, Dilip. The next question is a collection of many questions, but I think the whole concept is about the energy efficiency bonds. So one attendee sent it to us. Do you have experiences in any country about energy efficiency bonds? Who issue the bond? And is there a market for energy efficiency bonds? Do you think these bonds help ESCO companies to make more projects?
I don't have a lot of experience in energy efficiency bonds in developing countries. Most of my work has been in helping developing countries look at energy efficiency in ESCO markets. There have been some cases in developed countries in Europe. And yes, if energy efficiency bonds are created, there's a market for these, which right now generally does not exist in developing countries. But if the market can be created and bonds can be issued, then that creates a set of funds that can then be used, very similar to what I mentioned about the energy efficiency funds. And those funds can then be used to support the ESCO projects. But again, need to have a kind of a operating market for people to buy the energy efficiency funds to create that money.
Thank you very much, Dilip. And we have one more question for you. And the question is, it appears that China has developed a very large ESCO industry. You did not list China in your example of successful government actions. Can you comment on the Chinese ESCO experience?
China is obviously a special case. The Chinese situation is different from almost any other country. But it is very interesting that the Chinese ESCO market, which right now rivals or even is even higher than the US ESCO market, which used to be the biggest in the world until recently. Initially, the Chinese ESCO market was created by the World Bank providing funds to create 3 public ESCOs. 3 provinces created, 1 in each ESCOs, that then started working with other government agencies. It was an example of a set of public ESCOs created by the government with international help. Now in China, a very large portion of their market is government-owned, and even a lot of their industry is government-owned. So it was easy for these 3 ESCOs to essentially work with their industry and their buildings and create a market in those 3 provinces. When that successful experience was publicized, other provinces decided to do similar things. And that's how the ESCO market developed. But it was, again, over a period of about 15 years. And now the ESCO concept is quite common. But again, most of the ESCOs are working almost entirely with the government sector. And the government itself has taken a lot of actions to support that, establishing very tight targets for energy savings by industries. They started initially with the top 1,000, then went to the next 10,000, and then almost everyone. They hold the provincial government officials responsible for meeting energy efficiency targets, and they get punished if they don't do that. So a lot of these things are feasible in China, may not be easily replicated in other countries. But yes, it provides a good example of how governments can actually take stringent action to help promote energy efficiency in the public sector.
Thank you, Dilip. We received one more question for you. I know we're running out of time, and I think maybe it should be that the last question. And Dilip, the question is, shall the Super ESCO be owned by Ministry of Energy or owned by the Ministry of Finance, considering that the Ministry of Finance is responsible for paying the energy bills for the whole public buildings?
The answer to that is neither. A Super ESCO should be established as an independent organization, because attracting the right kind of people into the Super ESCO, compensating them appropriately for their responsibilities and functions, cannot be easily done within a government ministry structure. So the best thing to do is to create a separate entity with a separate board of directors. The entity is owned 100% by the government. The board of directors is appointed by the government, but includes not just people from the ministry, but also people from the private sector, from academia, and customer organizations, like industrial chambers of commerce and so on. And that board essentially drives the functioning of the Super ESCO. And it is entitled to sign, since it is a government agency, it's entitled to sign contracts, simple agreements with other ministries. But putting it in the Ministry of Finance or under the Ministry of Energy or Ministry of Economy may not be the best way for the Super ESCO to function. And I think I've worked on about 6 or 8 of these Super ESCOs, and each one has been created as a separate new entity.
Thank you very much, Dilip. It seems that we spend most of the time that we assigned for that webinar. So, ladies and gentlemen, finally, we come to the end of the webinar. I would like to say thanks to the panelists for the informative and interesting presentations, and to the audience for their active participation. We hope that the presentations will be beneficial for all stakeholders involved in energy efficiency and ESCOs. Thank you for your attention, and wish you a good day or night from Copenhagen.